The morning Conrad Hale was fired, he hadn't slept in 22 hours. That detail didn't make it into the termination letter. Neither did the reason he was 43 minutes late, or the fact that he had spent the previous night on his knees in the lower bay of Meridian Precision's private garage, his hands black with grease, coaxing a dead fuel delivery system back to life in a vehicle that belonged to the woman who would fire him before he had a chance to pour his first coffee. What made it into the letter was this: repeated tardiness, failure to adhere to scheduled shift commencement, conduct inconsistent with the operational standards of Meridian Precision Manufacturing. Claudette Renaud read the letter aloud. She stood at the center of the main floor, in the aisle between the hydraulic press stations and the calibration rigs, and she read it in a voice pitched to Carrie. 41 employees heard every word. Conrad stood at the far end of the aisle with his jacket still over his arm and his lunch bag in his hand, and he listened to the letter the way a man listens to weather, with the understanding that it doesn't care what you think of it. He didn't argue. He didn't explain. He thanked her, which confused everyone who heard it, and he walked back to his locker and emptied it into a cardboard box without ceremony. What nobody on that floor knew, what Claudette Renaud herself did not yet know, was that Conrad had left the building at 5:48 that morning. The garage log would have confirmed it, but the garage log, as it turned out, had a gap in it that nobody could explain. Conrad Hale had worked at Meridian Precision for 11 years. He was 44 years old, broad through the shoulders, quiet in the way that people sometimes mistake for slowness, until they watch him take apart a seized timing assembly with the patience of a man who has decided that the world will wait for him, and not the other way around. He had a daughter named June who was 7, and he raised her alone in a house on the eastern edge of Tilbrook, Ontario, where the streets ran flat and wide and the winters came early. His wife, Marta, had died 4 years ago. Pancreatic cancer, 11 weeks from diagnosis to end. He didn't talk about it much. June had been 3. She didn't remember her mother the way Conrad needed her to, which was something he carried quietly in the space behind his sternum, right next to the pride he felt every time she corrected his pronunciation of something. He had kept working through the grief because there was June to consider, and because work was the thing that made sense to him in a way that grief never would. Meridian was a precision manufacturing firm. Aerospace components, mostly some medical equipment subcontracting, some proprietary prototype work for clients who signed NDAs thicker than Conrad's wrist. He was the senior diagnostic technician for the private fleet and the prototype division. It wasn't glamorous work. It was the kind of work that mattered quietly, in the way that the people doing it never got thanked for. His direct supervisor was a man named Stuart Mack, mid-50s, decent, the kind of manager who knew when to leave a capable person alone. Stuart had hired Conrad when Conrad was 33 and grieving a different kind of loss. He had recognized something in Conrad that Conrad hadn't yet recognized in himself, that the man was gifted at understanding the logic of broken things. Claudette Renaud had arrived 14 months ago as the new chief operating officer, appointed by the parent company's board following a restructuring that had replaced 3 senior leaders with one. She was 41, precise, credentialed impressively, and possessed of the conviction that operational efficiency and human consistency were related only insofar as one of them belonged in a spreadsheet. She had not warmed to Conrad. He was the kind of employee who made her uncomfortable, too competent to dismiss, too quiet to read, too well regarded on the floor to undermine without consequence. She had been looking for an angle for 8 months. The tardiness was the angle. The night before Conrad was fired began the way that particular kind of night always does, with a phone call at the worst possible time. It was 11:17 when his cell rang. He was in June's doorway, watching her sleep in the way that parents do when they have run out of useful things to do with their worry. The call was from a number he recognized as the facility's after-hours line. The voice on the other end belonged to a man named Kelsey Vance, who ran the evening maintenance rotation. There was a problem in the private garage, Kelsey said. Claudette Renaud's personal vehicle, a 2019 Aston Martin DB11, which she kept in the executive bay and drove exactly twice a week, had developed a fuel delivery fault that the diagnostic system could not isolate. The car was scheduled to transport a client delegation from Hamilton to the facility the next morning, 7 o'clock, as part of a contract presentation for the Ashcombe Aviation account. If the car was not running, the delegation would need to be rerouted, and the optics of that apparently were unacceptable. Conrad asked why they were calling him. He was not on the evening rotation. Kelsey said Stuart Mack had put his name down as the contact for complex diagnostics on the executive vehicles, and that nobody else available that night had the clearance for the private garage. Conrad stood in the hallway for a long moment, looking at June's door. He called his neighbor, a woman named Pat Okafor, who had been a kind of lifeline since Marta died, and asked if she could come over. Pat said she'd be there in 10 minutes. Conrad left a note on June's nightstand in the handwriting she called his emergency printing, which was different from his regular handwriting in ways that only June had ever catalogued. The note said he'd be home before she woke up. He believed that when he wrote it, he drove to the facility in the dark, badged into the private garage at 11:51, and looked at the DB11 for a long moment under the fluorescence. Then he got to work. The fuel delivery fault was not where the diagnostic system said it was. Conrad found that out in the first 20 minutes, which told him the actual problem was going to take the rest of the night. He didn't allow himself to feel anything about that. He had learned, in the years since Marta, to defer feeling things until there was time for it. What he found, 2 hours in, was a secondary fuel pressure sensor that had been partially blocked by a foreign component, a small metal sleeve, machined precisely, which did not correspond to any part number in the DB11 system. It had been seated carefully in a location that would produce intermittent fault readings, but would be difficult to locate without removing the entire pressure assembly. Conrad held the sleeve under the workbench light for a long time. He turned it over. On the flat end, barely visible, was a stamped marking, AV7. He set it on the workbench and didn't say anything to anyone about it. He photographed it with his phone. Then he kept working. By 4:30 in the morning, the car was running. He test drove it in the lower lot, 2 circuits, and the telemetry was clean. He wrote up a diagnostic summary on the paper log in the garage. The facility used a parallel paper system for the private bay as a redundancy measure, and he noted the foreign component, its location, its marking, and the time he'd found it. He signed it, he dated it, he left it in the overnight tray at the garage attendant station, which was standard protocol. What he did not know then was that his access log for that night, the entry timestamp, the bay usage record, the digital portion of his diagnostic report, would disappear from the system before 6 a.m. He left the building at 5:48. He drove home. June was still asleep. Pat was dozing on the couch with the television on low, and Conrad thanked her quietly and walked her to the door. He was in the shower when his phone rang again. It was Pat, calling from her own house. She had forgotten to tell him. The woman who was supposed to take June to school that morning, a care arrangement that had been in place for 3 years, had called the night before to say she couldn't make it. A family thing. She was sorry. The message had been sitting in Conrad's voicemail since 9 p.m. Conrad stood in the bathroom with a towel around his waist and did the math. He had 40 minutes before his shift. June's school was in the opposite direction from the facility. The backup care contact was unavailable. He had no other option that didn't involve leaving a 7-year-old alone, which was not an option. He called Stuart Mack. The call went to voicemail. He called the facility main line. He got the overnight desk, explained the situation, and was told that shift absence notifications had to go through the supervisor chain. He left a message. He got June dressed and made her toast. He drove her to school, walked her to the door, made sure she understood that he was proud of her for being patient, and drove to Meridian at a speed that he would later reflect was probably inadvisable. He walked onto the floor at Nun 14. Claudette Renault was waiting. The termination meeting lasted 4 minutes. Stuart Mack was not present. Conrad would find out later that Stuart had been told the meeting was a performance review and had been asked to stay off the floor. He would find out a lot of things later. At the time, he stood in the main aisle with his lunch bag and listened to the letter and said thank you, because the only alternative was to say something he couldn't take back, and Conrad had learned the hard way that words spoken in anger become their own kind of paperwork. He was boxing Amaz's locker when a hand appeared on the shelf beside his. Not grabbing, just resting there. He turned. It was a woman named Avery Tsui, who worked calibration on the 3rd press line and had known Conrad since his first week. She didn't say anything. She put a coffee cup from the break room next to the box and walked back to her station. He drove home. June was at school. The house was very quiet. He sat at the kitchen table and looked at his hands for a while, and then he looked at the photograph of Marta that June had taped to the refrigerator, not the professional one, but a candid, blurry one from a camping trip where Marta was laughing at something off camera. He had never asked June to explain why she'd chosen that particular photograph. Some things you let a child keep. He opened his phone and looked at the photograph he had taken of the component, the sleeve. AV7. He sat with that for a long time. Stuart Mack called Conrad at 2:17 in the afternoon. His voice was careful in the way that voices get when a person is navigating something they haven't fully mapped yet. He said he had just learned about the termination. He said he was sorry it had happened the way it had, and then he stopped talking, which told Conrad that there was more he wasn't saying yet. Conrad told him about the night before. All of it, the call from Kelsey Vance, the DB-11, the foreign component, the paper log, the timestamp on his exit badge. He told it the way he told most things, without editorializing, in the order it happened. There was a silence on the other end that lasted long enough to become significant. Stuart said, "The system shows no entry for you in the private garage last night." Conrad said he knew that. He said there was a paper log in the overnight tray. Stuart said he would look into it. Conrad said, "While you're looking, ask someone about AV7. He didn't explain what that meant. He hung up and went to pick June up from school. June had a way of asking the questions that adults spent most of their energy avoiding. She asked him in the car, with the directness that children deploy before they learn it, makes people uncomfortable, whether he had lost his job. He said yes. She looked out the window for a moment and then asked whether they were going to be all right. He said yes to that too, and meant it more than he usually allowed himself to mean things. She said, "Okay," and went back to looking out the window. Then she said, "I'm sorry I made you late." Conrad pulled the car over. He turned to look at her, really look at her, in the way that required more than peripheral attention. She was examining her shoelaces. He said, "That's not what happened." She said, "I know. I just wanted to say it anyway." He didn't say anything to that for a moment because there was nothing to say to it that would improve it. He merged back onto the road, and they drove home in a silence that was, for once, the comfortable kind. Stuart Mack appeared at Conrad's door the following morning at 7:30, which was notable because Stuart was not the kind of man who appeared at people's doors before 8. He had a manila folder under his arm and the expression of someone who has spent the night revising what they thought they understood. He said, "The paper log is gone. The overnight tray was empty when I checked it this morning." Conrad nodded. He had considered that possibility. Stuart sat down at Conrad's kitchen table, in the chair across from the photograph of Marta on the fridge, and he opened the folder. Inside were printed copies of 3 things. A work order from the night before that didn't list Conrad as the assigned technician. A digital access record that showed the private garage door had been opened at 11:54, but showed no badge ID associated with the entry, and a screenshot from the facility's internal maintenance platform, showing that the overnight diagnostic report for the DB-11 had been filed under a different employee number. A number, Stewart said, that belonged to a technician who had been terminated 6 weeks earlier. Conrad put his phone on the table and showed Stewart the photograph of the component, the sleeve, the stamp on the flat end. Stewart looked at it. He said, AV7 is a marking I've seen before. It's a part designation used by Ashcombe Aviation's internal fabrication division. Conrad watched Stewart understand what that meant. Ashcombe Aviation was the client whose delegation had been transported to Meridian's facility the morning of Conrad's termination. The contract presentation that had necessitated the DB-11 being road-ready, the account that represented, by most internal estimates, Conrad had overheard in 11 years of working there, approximately 30% of Meridian's projected revenue for the next fiscal cycle. The component in Claudette Renaud's car had come from Ashcombe. Conrad said, someone put it there to create the fault, and then someone made sure there was no record of me fixing it. Stewart said, that's an allegation that requires. Conrad said, I know what it requires. I'm not making it to you. I'm explaining what I found. Stewart closed the folder. He looked at the refrigerator photograph for a moment, the way people do when they are thinking about something and need a direction to aim their eyes. Then he looked at Conrad and said, I need to take this to the board liaison, not Claudette, above her. Conrad said, that was fine. Stewart said, this is going to take time and I can't promise you anything. Conrad said, I know. Then he said, the log entry, my exit badge timestamp. Someone would have had to access the security infrastructure to scrub that. That's not something a mid-level manager does alone. Stewart picked up the folder and held it under his arm. He stood at Conrad's kitchen door for a moment and said, Kelsey Vance put your name on that call list. Not me. I never designated you as the after-hours diagnostic contact for the executive vehicles. He left. Conrad stood in the kitchen and heard June moving around upstairs, the particular rhythm of her mourning, the way her footsteps had a signature he could read from 2 floors away. He put the kettle on. The board liaison's name was Hugh Carver. He was 62, deliberate in his speech, the kind of person who asks clarifying questions not because he doesn't understand, but because he wants to ensure that you do. He met with Stuart Mack on a Thursday, and 2 days later he called Conrad directly. He asked Conrad to walk him through the night of the repair without interruption, which Conrad did. When Conrad finished, Hugh was quiet for a moment, and then he said, You photographed the component. Conrad confirmed that he had. Hugh said the photograph is time-stamped. Conrad said it was. Another pause. Then, what credibility does a recently dismissed technician carry in a technical assessment of this magnitude? It was said without hostility. It was a genuine question. The kind asked by someone who is preparing to be challenged and wants to know what the challenge will look like. Conrad said, The photograph timestamp places me in the private garage between midnight and 5:48 in the morning. My exit badge entry exists in the raw security archive even if the processed record was altered. Those are 2 separate systems. The component itself is physical evidence that doesn't require my credibility, and the AV7 marking is traceable. Hugh said, Who else knew you were called in that night? Conrad said, Kelsey Vance. And whoever called Kelsey? Hugh said, Kelsey Vance resigned yesterday morning. The line was quiet for a moment. Conrad said, That's useful to know. Hugh said he would be in touch. The investigation took 19 days. Conrad knew about it in the way that people know about things that affect them when the people conducting the investigation are careful. Which is to say, he knew almost nothing in real time and had to piece it together afterward from the things that Stewart told him in fragments, over the phone, in the cautious language of a man who was trying to be honest without being imprecise. What emerged, eventually, was this. Ashcombe Aviation had a subsidiary relationship with a consultancy firm that had been quietly lobbying for Meridian's contract structure to be renegotiated in Ashcombe's favor for 14 months. The foreign component in the DB-11 had been introduced to create a mechanical failure that would reflect badly on Meridian's maintenance competency. Specifically, If the car had broken down during the client transport, the optics would have been damaging, and Ashcomb's people would have had documentation of the failure to use in renegotiation. Someone inside the facility had facilitated access and had agreed to ensure there was no clean diagnostic record. The inside person was not Claudette Renaud. That was the part Conrad had not anticipated. Claudette had been used, her car, her schedule, her administrative authority over termination, by someone who had correctly predicted how she would respond to a tardy employee on a critical morning. The termination had been a secondary benefit. The primary goal was the missing log. The inside person, as far as the board investigation could confirm, was a man named Kelsey Vance, who had by that point crossed into the United States and was not answering communications. Conrad learned this from Stewart over the phone on a Tuesday evening, while June was at the kitchen table working through a worksheet about fractions, her tongue pressed to the corner of her mouth the way Marta's used to do when she concentrated. He said, "What about Claudette?" Stewart was quiet for a moment. Then, "She fired you, based on a record that had been manipulated without her knowledge. That's not a defense, but it's context." Conrad said, "I know the difference." Claudette Renaud came to Conrad's house on a Saturday. She came alone, without notice, which suggested to Conrad that she had considered calling ahead and decided that giving him the option to decline was a risk she wasn't willing to take. He respected that, in the reluctant way that you respect a decision you wouldn't have made yourself. She stood at his front door in the kind of clothes that said she was not here as a COO. She looked, Conrad thought, like someone who had rehearsed what she was going to say, and then discarded it on the way over. She said, "I owe you an apology that I'm not sure I know how to give correctly." He said, "Come in." She sat at the kitchen table, the same chair Stewart had sat in, and she looked at the photograph of Marta on the refrigerator in the way that people do when they are looking for something to hold on to in an unfamiliar room. She said, "I made the decision to terminate you based on a record I didn't verify, and an assumption I didn't question. I knew your history at Meridian. I chose not to let it complicate what felt like a clean, justifiable action." She stopped. It wasn't justifiable, and it wasn't clean. Conrad put 2 coffees on the table and sat across from her. She said, "The board has authorized your reinstatement at your previous classification, with back pay for the period of termination. Stewart advocated for an additional adjustment to your diagnostic lead designation. That's been approved." Conrad wrapped his hands around his coffee. She said, "Separately from all of that, separately from what the board has decided, and what HR will send you in writing, that I made a decision in front of your colleagues that I don't have a way to undo, and I'm sorry for that, publicly." Conrad said, "I heard you." She looked at him. She said, "Are you going to come back?" He said, "I haven't decided yet." She nodded. That, he thought, was probably the right response. She was at the door, her hand on the frame, when he said, "The car ran clean. You should know that. Whatever else was happening, whoever put that component in there, the car was safe to drive when I left it. I want you to know I finished the job." Claudette Renaud stood at the door for a moment without turning around. Then she said quietly, "I know. Stewart showed me the photograph timestamp." She paused. "That was the first thing that didn't add up. That's what made me start asking questions." She left. Conrad stood in the kitchen. Upstairs, June's footsteps moved from her bedroom to the bathroom and back, the familiar architecture of a Saturday morning. He heard the water run. He heard her singing something under her breath, tuneless and completely assured, the way children sing when they don't know anyone is listening. He picked up his phone and called Stewart. Stewart answered on the second ring. Conrad said, "I'll come back Monday, but I want the diagnostic lead designation to come with a direct reporting line, not through the COO office." Stewart said, "Already in the proposal." Conrad said, "And I want Avery Tsui moved to senior calibration. She's been running that station at a senior level for 2 years. Stewart said, "That one I can't promise." Conrad said, "Then put it in front of someone who can." There was a pause on the other end, and then Stewart said, "Anything else?" Conrad looked at the refrigerator, at Marta, laughing at something no one could see, blurry and permanent and entirely herself. He said, "That's enough for now." He hung up. He heard June coming down the stairs, the specific cadence of her, 7 years old and unhurried, the sound of someone who has decided that Saturday belongs to her and is correct about that. She appeared in the kitchen doorway in her socks, looked at him for a moment and said, "Are you going back to work?" He said, "Monday." She considered this. Then she said, "Can we have pancakes?" He said yes. She climbed onto the counter stool and reached for the syrup before he had even found the mixing bowl, which was such a precise expression of her particular personality that he almost laughed. He got the bowl down. He measured the flour by habit. Outside, the October light was coming in flat and pale through the kitchen window, the way it does in Ontario in the middle of autumn when the season is making its intentions plain. He had spent a night fixing something that belonged to the person who fired him the next morning. He had done it without a witness, without a record, without any expectation that it would matter. He had been seen, in the end, not by anyone he asked to see him, but by the work itself, by the photograph on his own phone, by the timestamp no one thought to check, by the evidence of a job done cleanly in the dark. He wasn't sure what to call that. He didn't have a name for it that felt adequate. He just knew that he had driven to that garage because Marta had raised him to understand, in the years before she died, that you do the job because the job needs doing, not because someone will find out that you did it. June slid the syrup toward him without being asked. He mixed the batter. The kitchen smelled like butter and coffee and something he didn't have a word for, which was the particular warmth of a Saturday morning, with nowhere to be and someone worth staying for. He made the pancakes. June ate 4 of them. She left syrup on the counter and didn't notice, and he wiped it up without saying anything, which was, he had come to understand, one of the small fluent languages of loving a person.